It was just past midnight when an urgent message swept through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Princess Anne had invoked a rarely used royal protocol. Her demand? An immediate emergency vote to strip Queen Camilla of her title, and the reason sent shockwaves through every royal household. For centuries, such a move had only been whispered about in times of absolute crisis. It was a mechanism buried deep within the royal constitution, a clause designed to protect the monarchy from a scandal so severe that it threatened the very survival of the crown. Few living royals had ever witnessed it being used, and fewer still believed it ever would be. Yet, here was Anne, decisive and unyielding, reaching for it in the dead of night. Those who knew her were not surprised by her resolve. Anne had built her life on the principles of duty, service, and fierce loyalty, not to individuals, but to the monarchy itself. She was the one who acted when no one else dared, the one who confronted storms rather than letting them fester behind closed doors. But even for her, this was uncharted territory. The corridors hummed with confusion and fear as word spread. Senior household staff were roused from their beds and instructed to prepare briefing papers. Aides hurried to secure transport for key royals, summoning them to Windsor and Sandringham without a single hint of the cause. In those tense hours, the palace seemed to hold its breath. The king's private secretary was seen moving quickly between offices, phone pressed tightly to his ear, his face grim. Junior staff exchanged hushed speculation, their voices trembling not just from the hour, but from the weight of the unknown. And somewhere in the vast network of whispers, the first theory took root. This was about Camilla. More precisely, about something she had done that crossed an invisible line. The rumor grew with every passing minute. A breach of trust, one source claimed. Something the princess will not tolerate, said another. But no one could agree on the details. Those closest to Anne refused to speak, their silence only deepening the mystery. The very air seemed heavier that night, thick with anticipation, and the foreboding sense that the royal family was about to be pulled into a crisis it could not easily contain. Anne's summons carried a weight that made it clear this was not about petty disagreements or personal grudges. This was about survival, about safeguarding the integrity of the monarchy before the damage became irreversible. And yet, behind her steely resolve, there was something else, a shadow of something deeply personal, a wound long concealed, now reopened by actions she could no longer ignore. It was as though history itself had come knocking, demanding that the past finally be reckoned with. But the true trigger for Anne's late-night action was not just political, it was deeply personal. And it began with something hidden for decades. Behind palace doors, a guarded envelope was passed into Anne's hands. Its contents would ignite a storm that even the king himself could not stop. It was no ordinary piece of correspondence. This envelope had been locked away in the deepest archives of Windsor, shielded from public eyes and even from many within the family. Its seal bore the unmistakable mark of Queen Elizabeth II herself, a personal emblem she reserved for matters too delicate to entrust to anyone but her most trusted confidants. For years, no one dared to disturb it. But now, in the midst of rising tensions and quiet whispers of betrayal, the envelope had found its way to Anne, and the moment she broke the seal, the world as she knew it began to shift. The letter inside was unlike anything Anne had ever read from her mother. It carried no warmth, no familiar anecdotes, no gentle counsel about family life. Instead, its language was clipped, deliberate, almost foreboding. It spoke of safeguarding the crown's dignity at all costs, and warned of those who, in seeking to serve it, may in truth be seeking to serve themselves. Anne read the words again and again, the weight of their meaning pressing down on her chest. This was not a vague musing. It was a warning one that now rang with chilling clarity in light of recent events. Her mind began to turn over the last few months, replaying small incidents that had once seemed inconsequential. Private engagements subtly shifted into Camilla's sphere. Advisors known to be loyal to the queen consort gained sudden influence in decisions far beyond their remit. Ceremonial roles, once distributed with care and tradition, being reallocated in ways that unsettled Anne. It was as if Camilla was weaving an invisible net, one strand at a time, until the monarchy itself would be caught in it. And now, staring at her mother's words, Anne could no longer ignore what had been happening in plain sight. In her mind's eye, she was back in one of her final private meetings with the late queen. The room had been quiet, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Elizabeth had looked at her with a gaze that pierced through titles and formality, speaking in a tone low and deliberate. "The future," she had said, "must remain untarnished." At the time, Anne had taken it as a reminder to protect William and his children, to shield them from the political storms that had battered the family for decades. But now, she saw the message for what it truly was: a coded directive, a call to act if anyone, no matter how close to the throne, threatened the integrity of the crown. That final conversation and the letter in her hands fused into one undeniable truth. Camilla's recent maneuvers were in direct violation of the sacred trust her mother had so fiercely guarded. This was no longer a matter of personal distaste or political disagreement. It was a breach of the moral contract on which the monarchy stood. Anne felt the blood rise in her veins, the clarity of purpose sharpening with every breath. What she held was not just a relic of her mother's wisdom, it was a command. And if she were to honor it, she could no longer operate in the shadows. She would need to move swiftly, decisively, and without apology. The course was set. The family might fracture, the public might rage, but Anne knew there was no alternative. The line had been crossed, and the Queen's words had lit the path forward. What Anne learned next would transform private suspicion into a public confrontation that could break the monarchy apart. While the nation saw a smiling queen consort, inside the palace, Camilla had been orchestrating moves that would leave her influence unchallenged until Anne caught on. To the public, her charm appeared effortless, her presence merely supportive to King Charles's reign. But behind gilded doors, Camilla's hand was quietly steering matters far beyond ceremonial duties. Step by step, she was extending her reach into areas once reserved exclusively for the sovereign. State preparations, foreign briefings, and internal communications began to bear her subtle fingerprints. What looked like harmless involvement was, in truth, a calculated expansion of authority. Anne, with her instinct for spotting trouble before it fully took shape, noticed the pattern early. Royal advisors who had always answered directly to the king were now taking private audiences with Camilla. These weren't casual exchanges, they were strategy sessions, and the guest list to these gatherings was telling, figures known for their skepticism toward William and Catherine's vision of a modern monarchy. The more Anne listened, the more she realized this wasn't about helping Charles. It was about reshaping the crown in Camilla's image, securing a place of untouchable permanence for herself. Her methods were clever. By using royal charities, she extended her influence into regional politics, without ever appearing to challenge constitutional boundaries. Invitations to galas and openings were carefully chosen to court regional leaders who could sway public opinion in her favor. Grants and patronages were directed toward causes aligned with her own network, subtly tying loyalty to Camilla's continued presence at the heart of the monarchy. Even the staff within the household began to shift their loyalties. Aides once fiercely protective of Charles were quietly gravitating toward her camp. Anne understood why Camilla rewarded her allies well, often with positions and honors that bolstered their standing inside and outside the palace. But the most troubling sign came when Anne began to see ceremonial duties reassigned. Events traditionally entrusted to William, Catherine, or long-serving members of the family were suddenly redirected to Camilla's closest allies. It was done discreetly, buried under official explanations about scheduling conflicts or representational balance. But the intent was unmistakable. These moments, small on their own, formed a deliberate tapestry, a network of control that could not be easily unraveled. Then came the turning point. A memo, never intended for Anne's eyes, was mistakenly sent to a staff member loyal to her. It laid out a clear framework for ensuring stability of the Queen Consort's role beyond current succession expectations. The language was cold, administrative, and damning. This was not about supporting Charles. This was about securing permanent influence, regardless of who wore the crown in the future. Anne read it once, then again. Her resolve hardened with each line. The quiet power grab was no longer theory. It was documented intent. She knew from that moment there would be no reversing course through subtle warnings or private counsel. Camilla was already too entrenched, her network too well placed to be dismantled by quiet diplomacy. This was no longer a private concern. It was a direct threat to the monarchy's future. Anne's path forward was now certain, and it would lead straight to confrontation. But the palace drama was about to burst into the open, not through political maneuvering, but through a public spectacle no one saw coming. It was supposed to be a quiet Windsor luncheon. Instead, it became the scene of a fiery standoff between the king's sister and his wife. The table had been set for a small, intimate family meal, intended to project unity in the midst of growing public speculation. Yet, within minutes, the atmosphere shifted from cordial to combustible. Staff positioned discreetly at the edges of the room later recounted the moment when polite conversation gave way to sharpened tones, the undercurrent of tension that had been building for weeks, finally breaking the surface. What began as an exchange over royal schedules quickly escalated into a direct, unflinching accusation from Princess Anne herself. Her voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the hum of clinking glasses. She accused Camilla of deliberately undermining the rightful line of succession by using her position not to support the monarchy, but to bend it toward her own permanence. The words were not vague. They were pointed, unyielding, and left no room for misinterpretation. Staff who overheard said the room fell into an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that comes when no one dares breathe for fear of shattering the fragile control holding the moment together. Camilla's response was swift and cold. She didn't deny the accusation outright. Instead, she reframed it, casting herself as the sole figure capable of holding the monarchy together in a time of uncertainty, subtly implying that others lacked the resilience or experience to carry the institution forward. Her tone carried the weight of someone who believed the throne could not survive without her, and her gaze never left Anne's. It wasn't defiance alone, it was a challenge. Charles sat at the head of the table, a man visibly torn between the two most formidable women in his life. Witnesses said his hands tightened around his utensils, his eyes darting between them as though searching for a way to de-escalate without surrendering authority to either side. But he found none. The tension was not his to control. This was a battle of wills, fought in words, but heavy with implications for the crown's future. Anne, unwilling to yield, pushed once more, her voice steady, but carrying the unmistakable weight of finality. "This is not about you, Camilla. This is about the crown, and it will endure without you." It was a line that left no room for reconciliation, a verbal strike that hung in the air long after the words had been spoken. Then, without warning, Anne stood. She left her plate unfinished, her chair pushed back with deliberate quiet. That simple act of refusal to share another moment of the meal was a silent declaration of war. In royal terms, walking away from the table before the king's dismissal was an unmistakable statement. The unity of the family had been broken. By nightfall, the confrontation had set off a chain reaction, one that would drag the entire Privy Council into a crisis. Behind closed doors, Charles faced an impossible choice: defend the woman he loves, or preserve the crown his mother entrusted to him. In the quiet sanctuary of his private chambers, the weight of that decision pressed down with a force that no monarch's training could prepare him for. Camilla was not merely his wife. She was the partner who had weathered storms with him, stood beside him through decades of public scrutiny, and shared in his most private moments. Yet Anne's accusations were not to be dismissed lightly. They carried the weight of conviction, supported by a pattern of events that, if left unchecked, could change the monarchy forever. Charles knew that to defend Camilla entirely might mean betraying the sacred duty he had sworn to uphold. But to side with Anne would mean fracturing his marriage in a way that could never be repaired. He sought counsel, but even those closest to him could not offer a solution without risk. In private conversations with his most trusted aides, Charles revealed the depths of his fear not just of a public scandal, but of a backlash that could erode the monarchy's already fragile standing. "One wrong move," he confided, "and we invite chaos." The palace could withstand many things, but open warfare between its most senior figures was a threat like no other. In the stillness of those late hours, Charles's mind drifted to his mother's final instructions, words spoken in measured tones that seemed, in hindsight, almost prophetic. She had told him to guard the crown as a living trust, not merely for himself, but for those who would come after. She had hinted at moments when personal happiness might have to be sacrificed for the sake of the institution. At the time, he thought it a general warning. Now, he wondered if she had foreseen this exact conflict, if she had known that the day would come when his love for Camilla would collide with his duty as sovereign. The situation was further complicated by William and Catherine. Though they avoided public comment, their quiet but unwavering support for Anne's position did not escape Charles's notice. They were not merely standing by family loyalty, they were safeguarding the line of succession, a role that one day would be theirs to fulfill. Their presence in the discussions served as a constant reminder that his decision would shape not only his reign, but theirs as well. In a desperate attempt to buy time, Charles considered delaying the emergency vote. He reasoned that allowing tempers to cool and the media frenzy to fade might create space for compromise. But even as he weighed this option, he recognized the danger. Delays could be seen as weakness, a failure to confront the crisis head-on, and the press would devour any sign of hesitation. The monarchy, after all, was built as much on perception as on tradition. The history he had studied since childhood haunted him now. Past royal scandals, abdications, betrayals, secret agreements, each carried the same lesson. The longer a crisis lingered, the deeper the wound it inflicted. The crown could survive scandal, but it could not survive indecision. He had to act, and soon, but outside the palace gates, the story had already leaked, and the court of public opinion was preparing its own verdict. As dawn broke, headlines screamed of a royal rebellion, and the people were choosing sides. The airwaves were saturated with speculation, every network scrambling to dissect the events that had unfolded in Windsor. The announcement of Princess Anne's demand for an emergency vote to strip Camilla of her title had ignited a storm that no palace press office could contain. Television studios ran rolling coverage, with royal commentators and political analysts filling the hours with theories about what had triggered such a seismic move. Newspapers sold out within minutes, their front pages emblazoned with dramatic headlines and unflattering photographs, framing the conflict as the most significant royal crisis in a generation. Public opinion fractured almost instantly. Early polls revealed a stark divide. Those who revered Camilla for her years of service and loyalty to Charles rallied in her defense, insisting she was a stabilizing force in turbulent times. Others, fiercely protective of tradition and the late Queen's legacy, sided with Anne, arguing that the monarchy's dignity could not be compromised, even for the king's consort. The numbers shifted by the hour as new revelations surfaced, each side growing louder, more entrenched, more unwilling to yield. Social media became a battlefield. Hashtags demanding Camilla's immediate removal trended alongside others, accusing Anne of overstepping her bounds. Influencers, bloggers, and political figures weighed in, each framing the crisis to suit their own audience. Leaked clips of past interactions between Anne and Camilla were dissected frame by frame, with armchair analysts claiming to spot years of unspoken animosity. In a matter of hours, the debate had transformed from a palace dispute into a national obsession. Outside Buckingham Palace, the tension spilled into the streets. Protesters gathered, some carrying banners demanding, "Protect the Crown," while others waved signs reading, "Stand with Camilla." The gates became a flashpoint where chants clashed, voices rising in defiance of the other side. The police presence grew, wary of the volatility, as even tourists found themselves swept up in the charged atmosphere. Former palace insiders seized the moment, appearing on live television to share what they'd always suspected about the rift between Anne and Camilla. Some hinted at years of quiet hostility, subtle jabs in speeches, and private snubs at family gatherings. Others painted a picture of mutual respect that had only soured recently, making the current rupture all the more shocking. Every revelation, verified or not, was treated as another piece of the puzzle, feeding the public's hunger for more. The story spread far beyond Britain's borders. In Commonwealth nations, leaders and citizens expressed surprise and, in some cases, outright concern over what this meant for the monarchy's stability. Foreign papers framed it as a battle, not only for influence, but for the future of the crown itself. In countries where Republican sentiment had been quietly growing, the crisis was presented as proof that the institution could no longer hold itself together. The storm was no longer contained, it was global. And as the world debated, judged, and chose sides, the palace could no longer pretend this was a private matter. The lines were drawn, the stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences were impossible to predict. Yet, while the world debated, the royal family prepared for the moment of truth, inside the most guarded chamber in Britain. In the gilded chamber where history's most fateful decisions are made, the fate of Queen Camilla's title hung by a single vote. The air inside was dense with formality and unspoken tension, the kind that pressed against the skin and made even seasoned royals sit straighter. The emergency council had been summoned under a rarely invoked clause, one that demanded absolute confidentiality, strict adherence to tradition, and the presence of only those whose rank and position granted them the authority to shape the monarchy's course. The chamber's opulent setting belied the severity of the task at hand. There was no ceremony, this was judgment. The rules were precise, steeped in centuries-old protocol. Each member of the council would listen to the arguments, deliberate in private, and cast a vote that could not be altered once declared. There would be no abstentions, no delays. The decision would stand, irrevocable, and its consequences would ripple far beyond the palace walls. Only a select inner circle, the king, senior blood royals, and key constitutional figures held the power to decide. They all knew that this was not simply about Camilla's title. It was about the moral authority of the crown itself. Anne rose first. Her speech was not crafted for theatrics, but for impact. Every word was sharpened, deliberate, and charged with the weight of duty. She spoke of irreversible damage that would befall the monarchy if it allowed personal ambition to eclipse service. She reminded the council of the late Queen's unwavering commitment to preserving the dignity of the institution, warning that to ignore the current threat would be to betray that legacy. Her voice did not waver, though the emotion in it was unmistakable. Anne was not merely presenting an argument, she was delivering a warning, one that came from both her position and her bloodline. Camilla's reply was measured but unflinching. She framed herself as a victim of jealousy and intrigue, a target for those who resented her role and underestimated her contribution. She painted Anne's move as an act of personal vendetta, cloaked in concern for the crown. Her words carried a quiet defiance, an insistence that she had only ever acted in the monarchy's best interest, even when the cost to herself was great. Her gaze swept across the chamber, daring anyone to believe otherwise. The tension was palpable. Every pause felt heavy enough to break under its own weight. Glances were exchanged, but few dared speak. This was not a discussion that could be softened by compromise. It was an all-or-nothing reckoning. When the moment came to cast votes, it was done in solemn silence. Each declaration landed like a hammer strike in history, final and irreversible. The tallying was meticulous, the suspense unbearable. Those seated could hear the faint scratch of the clerk's pen marking the final count, each stroke pushing the room closer to the verdict that would define a generation of royal politics. And then, the result was announced. But the reaction was not what anyone expected. The chamber's verdict sent shockwaves through the monarchy, but the true battle had only just begun. The final count had barely been announced when the room seemed to fracture under the weight of its own silence. There were no cheers, no murmured agreements, only gasps from those who had not expected such a decisive outcome. The muffled sound of someone stifling tears and the stony stillness of others who refused to betray their thoughts. In that moment, every eye darted toward Camilla. She remained rigid, her expression unreadable, as though holding herself together was the only power she had left. Without a word, she rose from her seat, her departure as controlled as it was final. She didn't look at the cameras outside, didn't pause for the reporters' barrage of questions. Instead, she disappeared into the inner corridors of the palace, leaving behind an air thick with unanswered questions. Anne stayed seated, her hands folded, her gaze steady on the table before her. There was no triumphant smile, no visible display of vindication, only a quiet satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that this victory had come at an unthinkable cost. She had acted for the crown, but in doing so, she had carved a fault line straight through her family. The relationship strained by years of tension had now been pushed to the brink, perhaps beyond repair. Then came the king's voice, measured, deliberate, and carrying the kind of heaviness that revealed more than the words themselves. He acknowledged the council's decision with formality, but the grief in his tone was unmistakable. It was the grief of a man who had just watched the woman he loved diminished before the world, while knowing he could do nothing to alter the outcome without risking the very institution he had sworn to protect. His statement was short, a carefully balanced attempt to maintain dignity in the face of a wound that was still bleeding. In the hours that followed, William and Catherine stepped forward to steady the monarchy's image. Their public appearance was carefully orchestrated, but carried a sense of genuine purpose. They spoke of unity, of service, of moving forward together. To the outside world, they were the image of stability, two figures embodying the promise of the monarchy's future. But even as they smiled and reassured the public, those closest to them knew the truth. They were holding together an institution that had been rattled to its core. Behind the grandeur of official statements and ceremonial poise lay the unspoken question. Could the monarchy survive this open wound? The unity that had always been projected to the world now seemed like a fragile illusion, one that could shatter with the slightest tremor. Allies had become adversaries, and trust had become a currency too rare to trade freely. And as the palace lights dimmed, one final twist emerged that could rewrite everything we thought we knew. Just when the dust seemed to settle, a document surfaced that revealed the late queen had left one final instruction, one that made Anne's actions inevitable. For days, the palace had worked to contain the fallout. But behind the scenes, whispers of a sealed file began to circulate among senior staff. It was a senior palace archivist, long respected for his discretion, who finally confirmed its existence. The document, preserved in the Queen's private collection, had been marked for restricted review in the event of constitutional dispute regarding the position of the Queen Consort. It was the kind of contingency few ever imagined would be needed until now. When the contents were read aloud to those authorized to hear them, the words cut through every lingering doubt. In precise, unmistakable language, the late Queen had declared that Camilla's title was to be temporary, contingent on conduct befitting the crown and its enduring dignity. This was not a suggestion, not a passing note. It was a directive, a condition placed upon Camilla's role that left no room for interpretation. And in that moment, Anne's decision, so divisive only hours earlier, was reframed entirely. The revelation vindicated Anne in a way no speech or political maneuver could have. Her critics, who had accused her of acting on personal resentment, suddenly found themselves without ground to stand on. Even those who had questioned her timing began to understand she had not simply seized an opportunity. She had fulfilled an obligation laid down by the monarch they had all sworn to honor. The letter was a silent ally, speaking from beyond the grave with the clarity and authority only the late Queen could wield. For Camilla, the implications were devastating. Stripped of her title, she remained by the king's side, but her position was irrevocably altered. She was still his wife, still a member of the royal family, but no longer the Queen Consort. Every public engagement, every private audience, every future appearance would now carry the shadow of that demotion. She was bound to the king personally, yet separated from the full stature she had once commanded. The monarchy itself emerged from the crisis both bruised and, paradoxically, strengthened. In the eyes of traditionists, the enforcement of the Queen's directive reaffirmed the idea that the crown was greater than any individual who wore it. It was proof that even the highest positions within the royal structure were not immune to accountability. Yet, among the public at large, the spectacle had left scars. The family's fractures were now common knowledge, and the mystique of unity had been replaced by an awareness of deep and personal divisions. Still, there was a sense of inevitability that this was not an end, but the beginning of a far more scrutinized era. Every action, every choice by the remaining senior royals would be weighed against the standard set in that hidden document. The Queen's words had not only decided Camilla's fate, they had set a precedent that could one day be used again. And so, in a single night, the monarchy changed forever, not by a coronation or a death, but by the will of a princess who refused to be silent. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.